Wow, I am just awash in God bumps right now, and filled with so much joy and love and appreciation for all of you. Ah, good morning, Center for Spiritual Living Delaware, on this beautiful day where all this liquid love and joy is just raining down on us today. Ah, we are so blessed, this beloved community. So Wow. So for today, the theme for May is 2021 is Holy, Holy Uprising. And the topic for today is boldly living a new story. New Thought Minister Raymond Charles Barker shares this deep insight. All creation starts with desire. God desired self-expression, and the cosmos was born. The desires of your heart are the possibilities that can be manifested in your experience. And Ernest Holmes advises you to write your own life and script in these words. Today, you are going to take your life in your own hands, realizing God is ever with you. Please join me in boldly living a new story by affirming together. Today, I release my old story and behold the new me as the beloved. Yippee. And now, with the joyful, loving, open heart, welcoming back our beloved Reverend Dr. Kathleen John.
Oh, Jenny, I just love the energy you put into those affirmations. They really come alive with her, don't they? So I'd like to introduce to you Reverend David Alt, who I have known for years. Well, let's just say he's an acquaintance. I don't know him deeply, but I've seen him speak. I've heard him sing. In fact, I own a bunch of his songs that I've gotten over the years. You know, many of you don't know, but he was one of the people in the Alliance years ago who toured with Louise Hay. And for over 30 years, Reverend David Alt has been a prophetic voice for the human potential movement, a crusader for mindfulness, global literacy, and social justice. And what is his singular intention? It's guiding humanity into that great collective awakening. He's a person of my own heart. And as an award-winning author of the books Where Regret Cannot Find Me and The Grass is Greener Right Here, he is also a leadership coach, a global education advocate, and he leads by example, knowing that all people would rather see a lesson than hear one. And I know I've heard one of his talks on climbing the mountain, and I'm assuming it must be Kilimanjaro, because he's a great adventurer. He's hiked the Inca Trail in Peru, the Camino de Santiago Trail in Spain, and also summited Kilimanjaro in Africa. He also has this beautiful foundation that he started 15 years ago called the Kaleidoscope Child Foundation, whose mission is to advance vulnerable children and communities with sustainable education, life skills, and fresh water. So this Kaleidoscope operates schools and programs in Cambodia, India, and Guatemala, with more than 1,000 children served annually. I mean, he's doing a lot of great work in the world, as you can see. He's also, when he lives in Atlanta, and he was the dean of a council of multi-generational, multi-faith leaders who assisted others in dissolving systemic issues of unworthiness, bias, and racism while building equality, character, ethics, spirituality, and wellness. I could go on and on. I think you get the essence of what this man is all about. And so we are so blessed. We are so gifted. And honored to welcome you, Reverend David, into our hearts. Thank you for being here today.
How fun and how auspicious, I guess, to be your last Zoom guest minister. So what a treat. I got to tell you, my favorite moment of the whole morning was Virgie. When Virgie said to Marcy about the Snickers thing, it reminded me of how we have nicknames for our children. And so Marcy, that song now will always be the Snickers song. At least in the Delaware community. Isn't that true? I mean, we have all these different nicknames. So to me, it's the Snickers song. Thank you, Virgie, for that. Oh gosh, I was thinking the title of Boldly Living, a new story, a new paradigm, a new expression. And it reminds me of my all-time favorite quote. Do you have an all-time favorite quote? Mine comes from A Course in Miracles. And it's love brings up everything unlike itself. And the first time I heard that, I was like, what does that mean? And I would sit with it and I would sit with it. Love brings up everything unlike itself. And then it hit me. If I'm going to be someone who boldly stands up before anyone and says, I'm an advocate for love, then anything unlike love will rise up to stand next to me, not to test me, but to help me make good on my advocacy. And that's what I really took away from that particular quote. Love brings up everything unlike itself. So if you and I are going to boldly pronounce this new story, this new paradigm, then according to this quote, everything unlike the new paradigm, everything that is associated with the old baggage or the old identity will still continue to try to get our attention, to cling on to, and to do whatever it can in order to keep us where we are. I would tell that to students over the years. Love brings up everything unlike itself. Or if you say, I'm an advocate for peace, then everything unlike peace arises again to help us make good on that advocacy. And I would watch the faces of my students because they would go, I'm not going to say anything because they didn't want those things to come. And I go, but naturally in our evolution, isn't it true? Isn't it true that the old will reintroduce itself or continue to tap us on the shoulder in order to sort of help us make good on our decision to move forward? Are you sure that you want to expand beyond your conformity? And those are all the types of things that we get to look at and explore today, because what a huge title. What an enormous calling to boldly live a new story. And what makes us move beyond the intellect, beyond me just being this face on a screen talking about that, to you actually becoming so invested, not interested, but invested enough that when this is over today, some new decision is made. Some concrete application is explored. I remember years and years and years ago when I lived in Los Angeles, I wanted a patio table. I had this little postage stamp sized patio and I wanted to get this patio table. And I didn't have the funds for it. And I was driving around and lo and behold, there's a patio table on the curb that somebody threw away. Eureka. I picked up that patio table and shoved it into my car and got it home and slapped on a coat of paint. And it was good for about a week. And then I began to notice that the paint would peel. And so I'd slap on some more paint. And then about a week later, the paint would start to peel. And I became more curious about this table and I turned it upside down, and underneath the whole bottom layer of the surface of this tabletop was completely rusted. And all that I was doing was applying paint over something that needed a lot more attention. And there were several lessons in that. One was make sure that you can bring a level of specificity with regards to what it is that you're calling for. And the other, the utilization of the gifts that we are given. We've been given this gift of life. And yet there is a lot of things that we could associate with being rested that are going to sort of want to stand in the way of our living a bold new story. So I think of rust as themes. Do you know that you and I are walking around with a whole bunch of themes inside of us? Let me give you an example what a theme is. I don't have enough time. Do you realize that that's a theme? There's actually no truth to that. And yet, because it's so universally accepted and we say it all the time, it becomes a theme. And when you start to think about all of the collection of themes that we have within us, it's remarkable how we get locked into these identities, how we become loyal to these themes. Sometimes themes are started by what Carolyn Mace, the teacher and author, used to say were 6-second moments. She said something that literally could have taken 6 seconds is an established theme, or is something that you continue to carry around with you to this very day. 6 seconds. That's not a lot of time. That's like a second grade teacher looking at you and saying, why don't you just mouth the words, okay? And you may have loved to sing, but what did you do in that 6-second moment? You squashed, you pushed down that creative, free expression, and you started to cultivate a theme that said you couldn't sing or that you didn't have this particular talent. And it becomes really fascinating when we stop and get quiet and begin to consider or to become curious about all of the themes that we are carrying around with us that inhibit or rust us from boldly living a new story. And when I think about those 6-second moments, I think about my own personal story. It's very stereotypical of growing up poor in Southeast Texas and not having enough. And my father passed away when I was 7. And in the middle of the night, when the VA hospital called my mother to let her know what happened, that was back in the days of a rotary phone. There wasn't enough rooms to go around in the house that we lived in. So I slept on a cot in the corner of my parents' room. So I was right there where the phone was. I could hear the attendant nurse in the VA hospital informing me of my dad's passing. And then my mother thanked her and hung up the phone. She picked the phone back up, did those rotary dials, called my aunt, told her what happened. And then she said this, what am I supposed to do with a 7-year-old boy? And I heard that. And in my 7-year-old mind, I started to cultivate a theme that somehow I was in the way, that somehow my presence was uncomfortable or it was a burden. And what had just transpired, I was just adding to the level of difficulty. Now, I didn't sit up in my little cot and make this proclamation that this was my truth, but it was a seed planted that began to percolate. And it wasn't until I was an adult, until I was embarking upon a spiritual journey, that I even remembered that incident. But I was fascinated. I was fascinated how that seed had germinated and had created behavior within me that was indicative of that theme. So I want to ask you this morning, before we boldly live a new story, I think it's essential that we turn to the curiosity of our themes, that perhaps tell us that, why bother at this stage of life? Oh, you have explored new stories before, and you've created this affirmation, and you've stepped forward onto some new endeavor only to ... But you see, a lot of those things, whether they're personal sabotage or some low-level futility that is swimming within us, they're all just a part of themes. And themes are nothing more than thoughts that are being fed. And in order for us to really, really, genuinely, authentically begin to welcome in the boldness of a new story, then the new story will bring up everything unlike itself. It will bring up the theme. And what can be fun, yes, I'm going to actually call it fun. What can be fun is to begin to deconstruct the themes and to simply look at them for what they are. For example, the theme of me somehow being a burden. When I remembered the story, I remembered and was shown that what my mother said verbally had nothing to do with me. That it was the outpouring of perhaps someone who was grieving, even perhaps someone who was angry at being left in a situation with all these kids, being someone who was frightened and uncertain. It had nothing to do with me, the being of me. And yet I took it to have everything to do with me. And I'm wondering this morning if the themes that you might be carrying are the overlay or the product of a 6-second moment. And I want to offer you that they have nothing to do with you. That all that is a verbalization of an external world that is not a representation of your true authenticity. Because our founder, Ernest Holmes, said that you and I live in a perfect patterning. I love that. And you know, in order for something to be a perfect patterning, so what he was describing was not just the cosmological framework of our earth, but all of life. And he said, in order for that to be true, in order for us to accept and embrace and welcome in the ideology of a perfect patterning, then we must accept that everything in the cosmos is perfect. And where are you and I? We are in that, which by beautiful deductive reasoning means that our essential nature is perfect. And so when you start to play around a little bit with language and we talk about learning things, I like to look at the word learning and scrap it. And I say there's nothing to learn because we are already part of the entirety of creation. What we're really here to do is to unlearn all of the 6-second moments, is to begin to shed all of the things and the thoughts that prevent us, the rusted thinking, if you will, that inhibits us from boldly, not just living, but embodying the new story. And so in order to create this story, in order to welcome it, we have to begin to welcome a new narrative about ourselves. And to welcome a new narrative means that we have to become aware of the old narrative. We have to become aware of the thoughts that we are verbalizing about not being good enough. All of the stale collective ideology that says that we don't belong, not good enough, to this, to that. We have to notice it. Instead of turning away from those things and busying ourselves with intellectual affirmation, what if we turned to it and diffused it? What if we turned to the 6-second moments? What if we turned to the thoughts? What if we turned to the themes And we began to compassionately look at them and understand that they have nothing to do with us, because what we are essentially is a perfect patterning. Do you see the difference in the energy of turning to rather than turning away and busying ourselves in being spiritual? Turning to has its own level of vibrancy and maturity. Turning to the falsity so that we can begin to dissolve it is much like I would think in medieval lore, when the knight would turn to the dragon rather than continuing to run from it. And the moment that it turns to the dragon, it's like he reclaims his power. And the potency of the flames of the dragon are no longer a reality. And so to turn to the old narrative so that it can dissolve, to turn to it lovingly, and to see that it has no validity, gives us the space for the new narrative to come in. You know, sometimes what I say, in order to grow, you have to outgrow. In order to grow, you have to outgrow. Can we truly grow if we're running from the old narrative? Have we created the space, the spaciousness for the new narrative to take root? And so, in order to really welcome the new narrative, there are a couple of things I feel that are helpful. One is to become dissatisfied, to become, sometimes in New Thought circles, we will call it divine discontent, to actually welcome your dissatisfaction. I liken it very much to disruption. Can you imagine welcoming disruption? Welcoming dissatisfaction? It's the thing that in us that becomes sick and tired of being sick and tired. It's the thing within us that becomes weary of the old story. And I think that that's essential for growth, because when we grow weary and when we welcome the dissatisfaction, we become aware that a new story, a new evolution is actually possible. And so the dissatisfaction and the disruption then is the invitation to take our fist and to open them, to begin to release. And in this dissatisfaction and in this disruption, I think it's really important to begin to look for things that are prototypes of what you desire. You know what I mean by that? To begin to focus on things that are representations of your internal inspiration. To begin to go into high noticing. Some of our great new thought pioneers, like Emma Curtis Hopkins, she would talk about living in a state of high noticing. What is that? That's awareness. That's living in the essence of welcoming all of the time that the prototype or the thing that is calling you is all around you. You don't need to discover it. You don't need to learn it. You simply awaken to its presence already. And so in this dissatisfaction and in this disruption, space is being created, and we begin to open our eyes and to look at the inspiration that we need. Dr. Kathleen was telling you a little bit about my foundation, Kaleidoscope Child Foundation. And prior to the pandemic, much of my life is spent overseas. And we began in Cambodia, and we have schools and campuses in Cambodia now that offer free education to over 600 children. We moved that to India, where we are in slum territories and beginning to create pioneering literacy campaigns to children who just didn't know anything about that. And then also in Guatemala, in Central America, where there is a deeply a deeply disturbing new form of slave labor that involves a lot of young Guatemalan girls. And so when I think about the disruption in my own life, the dissatisfaction in my own life, and trying to take these principles and to bring meaning to them, there's no better way to practice than to be in an environment where they seem to be totally void. And Guatemala in particular, some of these young women, because they are multi-generational products of poverty and crisis mentality, it's hard to convince a Guatemalan mother that it's worth giving their daughter an education, because all they can really think about in that moment is the crisis. And so they don't bat an eye in sending their daughters to these slave labor camps. And here we are trying to convince them that, no, let's let your daughter have this education. And one particular girl, Gloria, in order to get to our school in Panajachel, she would get up, she would do her chores, and those chores are quite extensive. She would walk down a mountain, she would get on a bus, she would then get off of that bus after an hour, and then she would walk uphill into Panajachel just to get to the door of our school. And the light in her, the enthusiasm, whether there was a monsoon outside or not, was unfailing. And I decided to let Gloria be my prototype, to be my prototype for the perpetual hunger of good and possibility and solution. And so sometimes when I find myself in these disparities, I think of Gloria. And so it lets me dissolve dissatisfaction, disruption, dissolve. It lets me dissolve any tight clinging to a theme that tells me it's not worth it or tells me that solution isn't possible, because I think of her and I think how unfailing she is. And Gloria to me is the face of the universe. Gloria to me is the face of what a perfect patterning looks like, because there's nothing in the world of effect that stops her from showing up at that classroom door. In fact, the last time I was there before the pandemic happened, her ankle was swollen. And I said, Gloria, what's going on? And she said, I fell when I was getting off of the bus. And it wasn't until I actually even said anything that she noticed, because her focus was so much on the activity of what was happening in class. Dissatisfaction, disruption, dissolving leads to then what I would call dedication. Dedication. I heard that sometimes we are the amalgamation of the 5 people we spend the most time with. That kind of stopped me in my tracks a little bit. I was like, woo, the 5 people that I spend the most time with. And I realized I'm at choice of who I spend time with. I want to spend time with more Glorias in my life. I want to spend more time with people who have made space for solution. I want to be sort of on the bottom rung in the room so that I can continue to look up at them and continue to climb. I want to forever have beginner's mind. And so one of the ways that this helps is another quote, which I will close with today. And it was by a travel writer named Doug Boyd. And he said, the most powerful mantra that you can ever say is, I'm available. And then he said, look out, because if you mean it, your whole world will change. I'm available. So your tool to sand your rusted thinking, to actually move into the paradigm of a new story, is to let go of the how and to simply say, I'm available. I'm available. I'm available. And with that, I joyously pass this beautiful light of our service together back to Marcy.